So the title of this presentation is The Obsolescence of the Negro, Race Theorizing in the Chicago School of African-Centered Thought. The Chicago School, of course, so I get used to the Chicago School, of course, and that's not here. Let me go back. The Chicago School, of course, are those scholars who contributed to not only the formation of the Kemetic Institute of Chicago, but also the Temple of the African Community of Chicago, the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations, and of course, who were active at the University from the late 1960s, and so on. So at any rate, that's the Chicago School. And in this presentation, because of who's here, I probably don't need to say all this. So I'm actually going to skip over this. I did this for a different group the other day. So I just wanted to make sure people were clear. But I think y'all are clear. When I say Black people, when I say Africans, I'm talking about Black people. So at any rate, I'll keep it moving. One thing I will say, however, because so there are a couple of things I guess I will point out with respect to race. Race is this concept that Europeans created as a way of conceptualizing their dominance. I'll talk more about that a little later on. Racism is the ideology as well as the social system that Europeans created in order to ensure that dominance. And further, this idea of racialization is a process whereby Europeans have enforced this idea, this conception of race, particularly with respect to this idea of groups being superior and others being inferior. Also, this term racialized and oppressed people. Dr. Ben Levy made a remark earlier about the term people of color. I myself don't use that term. I did in my youth. But as I got older, I found it problematic, and have instead referred to folks who are the victims of white supremacy as racialized and oppressed people. That is, groups that have experienced a process of racialization, whereby, again, they've been constructed as racial groups, and in the context of the European imagination, that racial identity carries with it meanings generally negative, and have also been subject to a process of oppression, so racialized and oppressed peoples. And then white supremacy. I'll use Dr. Anderson Thompson's definition of white supremacy, which he defined as a contest among Europeans regarding who among them should rule the world. One of the problems is that, and again, folks with you all, like you all, this may not be an issue, but for many of our people, white supremacists are people like the Ku Klux Klan and the Aryan Nation and the neo-Nazi skinheads. Well, certainly those are white racists, but white supremacists are the people that run the World Trade Organization, whether they're African or otherwise. White supremacists are the people that run the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. White supremacists is the US State Department. White supremacists is the British government and the French government and the American government, the entire apparatus of it. White supremacy are the police forces of Western countries all over the world. That's white supremacy, not just a bunch of white paramilitaries out in streets talking about how much they hate Black people. They all hate Black people. So we'll keep it moving. I just want to acknowledge these three men. Their ideas contribute significantly to this particular paper. Of course, Dr. Jacob H. Carruthers, who I've been able to write about quite a bit, and his ideas figure very prominently in terms of what I'm going to share. Dr. Bobby E. Wright, and his very keen insight in terms of the psychology of racism. That is, racism is a type of pathology in the white mind. And then, of course, Dr. Anderson Thompson, who many positive things have been said about today, and I'll say a few more about him later on. So I'll save that for later. In this presentation, I talk about the origins of racism, and I won't spend a lot of time on some of these other parts because I don't have a whole lot of time, but I will say just a few things. There are a number of theories that have been advanced in terms of the origins of racism. You have a number of scholars who have argued that racism emergence is a consequence of the process of capitalism's formation. So for instance, Walter Rodney in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, talked about this process whereby European societies in this process of demanding of African captives facilitated eventually the fundamental reorganization of African societies. And so you had this is occurring in several stages. You have at one level the extraction of African people, and subsequent to that, the unraveling of African societies. The second stage was slavery, and particularly as when we reach the 18th century, the demand for African captives had become so significant that the Africans become the principal, and I'm going to put this in quotation marks, commodity demanded by Europeans. And so for Africans who were now drawn into the orbit of European economies, for those who participated in this fiendish system, the capture of Africans and the maintenance of the type of military apparatus necessary to ensure the effectiveness of this enterprise became their sole economic preoccupation. For those societies that were on the receiving end of this process, their preoccupation became survival. where they had to organize themselves for their collective defense. And so this led to the malformation of African societies and in relation to that African economies. And then third is the formation of racism in relation to African people's constructionist shadow. That is, as Europeans are engaging this process of the domination of African people, they begin to construct this idea, we're doing this to these people because they are inferior. So you have this explanation of Black inferiority coming as a consequence of domination. Eric Williams makes a very similar argument in Capitalism and Slavery, essentially that having exhausted the viability of indigenous as well as Irish folks as sources of labor in the Americas, eventually the Europeans turned to Africans. Africans were useful in a number of important respects. I'll come to those in a moment. However, it was the utility of Africans that made Africans particularly valuable. And as a way of rationalizing this, the Europeans fabricated this idea of racism. And then, of course, you have the ideas of George M. Frederickson. Real quick, make sure you put the questions in the chat rather than the Q&A. It'll be easy to respond to them later on. Frederickson essentially links the formation of racism to late 15th and early 16th century Spain relative to the Reconquista. If you all recall, the Moors had conquered Spain in the 8th century. However, the Spaniards, as well as the Portuguese, continued to fight for their independence. And finally, in 1492, they reached the culmination of this Reconquista, where in 1492, all that stood between them in total domination of the Iberian Peninsula was the city of Granada. And when Granada fell in that great battle, the Catholic Spaniards set themselves about the business of reorganizing the society in their own interest, but also they sought to establish a national identity. They wanted to establish Spain as the premier Christian nation in Europe, if not the world. The obvious challenge to this is that you had a very large Muslim population and a very large Jewish population. The solution to both of these problematic populations was mass conversion. However, unsatisfied with this, eventually the Spaniards resolved to kick all the Muslims out in the early 16th century and to subject the Jews, now conversos, to persecution. They argued that Jewishness was in the blood. And what's wrong with Jewishness? Well, they argued that the Jews were guilty of deicide, that is, the killing of a god, in this case referring to the Christian Messiah, Jesus. And so the Spaniards, Frederickson argues, pioneered this idea of racism, linking it to linking it to this reorganization of Spanish society after the Reconquista. But also when they get into this business, right, of enslaving Africans in the Americas, when asked to account for this, again, humans inevitably feel the need to give reasons for why we do what we do. We make meaning out of our actions, even if the way we make that meaning is fraudulent. And indeed, for the Spaniards, it was fraudulent. They argued that the reason they were enslaving these Africans is because these Africans were, in fact, the descendants of the curse of Ham. Now, this was untrue. What made Africans especially suitable for enslavement from the vantage point of the Europeans is that Africans were A, generally immune to European diseases. Africans were 2, generally identifiable among the indigenous as well as European population and the European settler colonies of the Americas. 3, the capacity of African communities to engage in acts of retribution relative to members of the community having been taken captive was diminished because those communities were on the other side of the Atlantic. And 4, probably most importantly, the Africans had technical knowledge that the Europeans could exploit. Rather than saying 1, 2, 3, 4, all those very logical reasons, the Spaniards said, no, these Negroes, they are in fact the descendants of Ham. They are cursed by God. And so Frederickson argues essentially that the origins of racism can be linked to this, but of course we get a fundamentally different explanation from both Drs. Carruthers and Drs. Thompson. Dr. Thompson I didn't put in this PowerPoint, but after watching the video, I feel the need to share it. So I'll start with Dr. Thompson. What he said in the video, very briefly, he actually argues that racism's origins are ancient. That in fact, we can find the origins of ancient in terms of the early project of the reorganization of societies which were established by African people by the Aryan invaders. Consider ancient India, for instance, and the toppling of the indigenous population of India by the Aryan hordes that streamed in from the north. Dr. Carruthers looked at this within the context of the European worldview, arguing that in fact, if we want to understand racism, we have to understand the cultural worldview which produces racism. Again, it would be insufficient, I think he would argue, for us to conceptualize racism's origins within the context of something as lately conceived as capitalism, but in fact, we must understand it as a byproduct of Europeans' way of seeing and being in the world. And so given that the ancient Aryan worldview was one that was conceived of as characterized as possessing as a world possessed of conflict at every conceivable level. Think about the Greek myths you read when you were in high school and elementary school, where you had gods versus gods, gods versus humanity, humanity versus humanity. right? And so you had conflict on every conceivable level. And this is what we call fundamental alienation. He argued that that ancient European worldview, of course, this idea of a world in constant conflict, is the foundation of even modern European thought, where modern European philosophers who on one hand produced theories about regarding regarding liberty, within the context of the Enlightenment, but those same theorists would provide elaborate justifications for the necessity of African slavery. Again, though they weren't positing conflict as an inevitable consequence of the organization of the universe based on the will of gods, they were, however, advocating for the formation of social systems which would inevitably produce and reproduce conflict, because no one wants to be oppressed. But they were advocating the oppression of African people as the easiest pathway to attain what they considered the good life. And so at any rate, he posited that racism, in fact, is not simply because of something as lately conceived as capitalism, but it is linked to the origin, to the way Europeans fundamentally see the world. So that's a little bit, 5 different perspectives on the origins of racism. In the paper, I get into some of these theories of racism. I won't get into all of these. I'll just say a little bit. Marxists, they link racism to capitalism. I'm sure you all have heard of critical race theory. And of course, there's been so much talk about critical race theory because of the Trump and his ban on CRT. But essentially, critical race theory is a theory that links racism to the to policy, really to policy in society. The operationalization of policy is a way to reinforce the dominance of whites. I could say more about it, but I'll keep it at that. And then, of course, you have people like cultural studies scholar Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall, in his work on media studies, conceptualizes ideas of race as he would refer to it as a floating signifier. That is, that race was something which was utilized race was something which took on various meanings, and it was the utilization of race as a type of symbolic representation of certain social qualities that was the best expression of how race operates in the society. For instance, consider this idea like people will use Black aesthetics, the aesthetic of Black people in this country, to equate things that are cool, right? So inevitably in the United States, cool means Blackness. And so you always see whites using the aesthetic of Black people. That's throughout the 20th century all the way to now, to equate coolness. This is what Hall was talking about. At any rate, then of course you have Dr. Bobby E. Wright, who argued that racism was linked to the racism was linked to the fact that Europeans were psychopathic. Psychopathic is the person who is incapable of remorse. This is very important. And I wonder, there's more that I can say about this, but I'll come to that in the time that I have remaining. But I'll leave it at, I'll use this image to dramatize what I'm saying. So of course, this is an image from an all too familiar experience of Africans in this country, the lynching. And again, do take note of the fact that none of these whites seem to be particularly alarmed over the fact that they have just murdered, quite likely unjustly, another human being, because in their eyes, they have not murdered a human being. They have indeed murdered a subhuman thing. Therefore, they felt no remorse for what they did. Again, Bobby Wright argues that Europeans essentially are psychopaths in relation to their actions towards African people. And then, of course, we come to Dr. Anderson Thompson, who argued that, and he referred to this, I think, briefly. I think you may have heard this briefly in the video. He would talk about the Negro question. He would argue that the Negro question was the perennial quandary of whites since the end of the era of enslavement, and would phrase the Negro question thusly: what is to be done about the troublesome presence of the Negro now that they are no longer needed as a source of labor? And he argued that because of this idea that Black people were essentially obsolete, which is what the title of this presentation comes from, that Black people were subsequently regarded as a social malignancy, that is, a problem to be solved. Well, if Black people are a problem to be solved, how therefore have white people determined to solve that problem? Well, here's what you have here. This is a placard from the state of North Carolina, who between the years 1933 and 1973 sterilized 7,600 people. Most, if not all of them, I think all of them were, but most of those were Black women. Why were these women sterilized? Sterilized because Blacks were deemed unfit to exist. This is in the context of the eugenics movement. Black people were deemed unfit, and hence our reproduction should be curtailed. This may sound kind of familiar to some of you all with respect to the whites who are presently very much concerned about population growth in Africa. Again, the Negro problem again, had to be solved. And how do you solve that problem? Well, curtail the reproduction of those people. You incarcerate those people and lock them away. You subordinate and suppress those people as best you can for the sake of creating conditions that will inevitably lead to death and/or misery, and so on and so forth. So, at any rate, um, I'll talk very briefly about Black movements, and what I do here is I juxtapose these movements. Much of what I do, and this is actually based on a paper that I wrote in relation to my lecture from Thursday. But what I do is I take this idea from Harold Cruz in his book Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. He argues that there are two streams in African thought, two streams in African history in this country: the nationalist stream and the integrationist stream. The nationalist stream is the stream of African people who insisted that African people are a nation within a nation that have a fundamental right to self-determination and the necessity to be sovereign in order to achieve our full potential. The integrationist stream argues that what Africans should do is that we should aspire to attain equality within European system. So what you have here are two contrasting images, of course. On the right, you have a sister, goodness, I remembered her name 2 days ago and I forgot her name now. Baba Larry probably remembers her name. This is a sister, her captives. Say it again.
Isn't that Mum Bet?
Yes, that's Mum Bet. What was her name? She changed her name though. It was Freeman was her last name. What was her first name?
You got me there. Right, I can't remember that.
Yeah, it was something Freeman. Something Freeman. So she changed her name when she got out from under the yoke of those Europeans. But this is the petition for her freedom. She was burned very badly, I think, with a hot poker by the Europeans who presumed to own her. So she petitioned the local magistrates for freedom and was granted her freedom. Again, I think she's an example of the integrationist path, because one of the elements of the integrationist path is appealing for equality for African people within the European system. On the left, you have a different image reflective of a different paradigm. That is an image of a maroon. This is actually an image of a maroon from Jamaica. There's probably some Negro, not none of you all, but probably some Negro in the world who would say, why didn't he choose the picture of a maroon from America? Without realizing that, especially after in the 19th century, in the early 19th century, most of the enslaved Africans that were brought to this country were brought from somewhere else in the Americas. So that brother, after he got done whooping on white folks in Jamaica and they caught him and persecuted him, they probably sent him here thinking that he had been beat down sufficiently, and he probably turned the tables on him. So you're at the Maroons. And the Maroons, of course, were of a mind that we should seize freedom and establish freedom on the basis of African sovereignty, on the basis of African self-determination, that we don't need to appeal to white folks to get our freedom. We can take our freedom. And so this is Martin Delany, who many consider to be the founder or the father of Black nationalism. He said that Africans in this country are a nation within a nation, and so on. I'll come back to Delany a little later on. Nationalism spawned a number of different schools of thought. You have Pan-African nationalism that argues that African people the world over are one people who have a shared destiny, and people like Marcus Garvey and Amy Jacques Garvey, as well as Amy Ashwood Garvey and so many others, Kwame Nkrumah, and so many others are exemplars of this idea. You have cultural nationalism, which is this idea that, in fact, Maulana Karenga would say that the core crisis and challenge in Black life is the cultural crisis and challenge, this idea that African people have to reclaim their culture, and that cultural worldview or that cultural consciousness will shape how they act in the world, and that is the thing that will catalyze our struggle for liberation. You have what people refer to as territorial nationalists. This is just best exemplified by the Republic of New Africa, and they were greatly inspired by Malcolm in his speech, where he said land is the basis of all independence, and argued that what African people needed to do was to establish a land base that identified 5 southern states: South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, that this should be our national territory. This should be the Republic of New Africa. And then, of course, the integrationist formation. I already talked about the integrationist stream a bit. Cruz talks about in his book, Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, as well as his book, Rebellion or Revolution, I think is the title. He also talks about communists. You could think of this as, when I wrote this, I refer to them as a third stream. Of course, Cruz dismissed that. He argued that the socialists were actually bound up in the integrationist stream. I don't have time to really get into that right now, but let's talk about what racism is. Dr. Anderson Thompson defined racism as a system designed to achieve the maximum exploitation of one race by another. Again, a system designed to achieve the maximum exploitation of one race by another. There's a couple of important things about this definition. First, racism is a system. It is not limited to acts of individual racists, whether overt or covert. It is systemic and structural, and as such employs the entire cultural apparatus in its continuation. Black people's culture is considered vulgar and grotesque, yet it is commoditized and generates billions of dollars for Europeans' culture industries. Black people are employed in the labor market in a way that is exploitative of our labor. And for those of us who are not employed, we often find ourselves incarcerated in the prison industrial system for participating in the underground economy. I could go on and on, but the point is that African people are subjected to subordination throughout the entire cultural apparatus, whether it's education, whether it's religion, whether it's policy, whether it's economics, what have you. Also, racism works to achieve, this is the second element of this definition, the maximum exploitation of one race by another. And this means the oppressor exploited at every conceivable level. So one of the things, and I'll just wrap this up, in terms of learning from these movements, the integrationist struggle, of course, is important. It's obviously beneficial for African people to have access to our resources, to be able to go to the store, use public transit, attend university, and so forth. Yet these things cannot be the aims of a people struggling for their freedom. And so one of the things that we have to be mindful of is that the integrationist movement, for all of its successes, has resulted in very uneven gains, that it has been most beneficial to the elite of Africans in this country, but not the masses. It has continued to rely irrationally so on moral arguments. You have many people out here today saying that Black lives matter. I've always been struck by this remark. I've always imagined that the recipient of this message was not, that the intended recipient of this message was not Black people, because I think we're very clear that our lives have value, but in fact, it was intended for our oppressors who couldn't care less about how much we think our lives matter. And their actions show that. And then finally, we have to ask, is the integrationist thrust even viable in a society such as this, which has increasingly moved toward neoliberal capitalism, right-wing populism, and so forth? I won't deal with the socialist position right now because I don't have a lot of time, but I will say that Black nationalism enduring relevance for us is evident in several respects. One, African people cannot achieve their full potential under the domination of another people. That African institutions are a necessary means to ensure the well-being of the community. The decolonization of African people's minds is a necessary step in the healing of our people and the transformation of reality. And finally, power and self-determination are inseparable. So I'll end with this, and this is based on the first paragraph in Dr. Bobby E. Wright's essay, The Psychopathic Racial Personality, where he refers to African people facing their moment of truth. And of course, if you were listening to the video earlier, you heard Dr. Anderson Thompson read that paragraph, so I won't reread it. However, this is what Dr. Thompson says, and I believe this has implications for how we face this moment. He says, when a people lose the knowledge of who they are, that is their culture, they lose the very foundation upon which their individual existence and their society is based. To combat this loss, each African person must be equipped with a grand vision of the future, a vision extending beyond personal interests, such that this vision becomes the embodiment of the vital interest and moral centerhood of the entire African world community. I refer to this vision as the African principle. And Dr. Thompson's perspective was that our collective striving should be to actualize that optimal future for ourselves, a future where we are free and independent. However, in order to do that, it is necessary that we both wage and win what Dr. Carruthers called the intellectual war. So with that, I'll stop. Again, Asante Sana.